The most dangerous weapon in 2026 is not housed in a missile silo. It is not guided by satellite or carried on a warship. It weighs almost nothing. It dissolves in water. And without it, the soil beneath every farm in the northern hemisphere produces approximately half the food it otherwise would. It is phosphorus. And as of February 2026, the global supply chain moving this element from the ground, where it is mined, to the fields where it is needed, has fractured in ways that will not become visible in supermarkets until the autumn. That delay, the gap between an agricultural input shock and its appearance in food prices, is the subject of this analysis. Because by the time the consequences are visible to ordinary consumers, the moment when intervention could have changed the outcome will have already passed. The famine, if that word proves warranted, is not a future risk. It is a present arithmetic. To understand the phosphorus story, it helps to begin with a fact that most people outside the agricultural sector have never encountered. Modern industrial agriculture does not run on soil. It runs on chemistry. The yields that allow roughly 8 billion people to be fed from the Earth's available farmland are not natural yields. They are engineered yields, produced by applying synthetic fertilizers that supplement what soil alone cannot provide. The three primary nutrients that commercial fertilizers deliver are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Agronomists refer to these by their chemical symbols, N, P, and K. Remove any one of them from the equation and crop yields fall, not gradually, but sharply. Phosphorus is arguably the most constrained of the three, for a reason that has no technological solution. Nitrogen can be synthesized from the atmosphere using industrial processes. Potassium is relatively widely distributed geographically, but phosphorus must be mined. It exists in economically recoverable concentrations in a small number of locations on Earth, and the distribution of those locations is not geopolitically neutral. Approximately 70% of the world's known phosphate rock reserves are located in a single country, Morocco. More precisely, a significant portion of those reserves lie in the Western Sahara, a territory whose political status has been disputed since Spain withdrew from it in 1975, and which Morocco administers, but which is claimed by the Sahrawi people represented by the Polisario Front. The company that controls most of Morocco's phosphate extraction and processing is OCP Group, originally the Office Chérifien des Phosphates, a state-controlled enterprise that is one of the largest fertilizer companies in the world by volume. In 2024, OCP reported revenues of approximately $9.6 billion. The company mines phosphate rock, processes it into phosphoric acid and finished fertilizer products, and exports those products to agricultural markets across Europe, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. When Morocco's export capacity is disrupted, for any reason, the consequences are not confined to Morocco. They propagate through every food-producing region that depends on Moroccan phosphate, which is to say, most of them. The second major concentration of phosphate production sits in China. China is both the world's largest producer of phosphate fertilizers and the world's largest consumer of them. In years when Chinese domestic demand is high and export policy is restrictive, the global market outside China faces a supply shortfall that Morocco alone cannot compensate for. In October 2021, China introduced temporary export restrictions on phosphate fertilizers, citing the need to ensure domestic supply. The restrictions were formally lifted in June 2022, but their effect on global fertilizer markets was significant and long-lasting. Spot prices for diammonium phosphate, one of the most widely used phosphate fertilizer products, roughly doubled between early 2021 and their peak in 2022. The shock created by those restrictions contributed directly to the food price inflation that accelerated globally through 2022 and into 2023. In 2026, a structurally similar dynamic was emerging, but driven by a different mechanism, not export policy, but logistics. The Red Sea crisis, that escalated through 2024 and persisted into 2026, had its most direct agricultural impact precisely here. Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden forced a significant portion of container and bulk cargo traffic to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. This rerouting added approximately 10 to 14 days to voyages between Asian and Middle Eastern ports and European destinations. It also added roughly $1 to $2 million in fuel and operating costs per voyage for large bulk carriers. Fertilizer, including phosphate-based products, moves primarily in bulk carriers. The economics of bulk shipping are highly sensitive to voyage length and fuel costs. When both increase simultaneously, freight rates rise, and the delivered cost of fertilizer at the destination port increases accordingly. But the Red Sea disruption was only part of the 2026 logistics picture. In the South China Sea, rising tensions between China and its neighbors had introduced a secondary layer of shipping uncertainty on routes carrying potash from eastern producers. Insurance premiums for vessels operating in both regions had increased significantly. The combination of these two pressure points, Red Sea and South China Sea, created a fertilizer supply chain that was simultaneously longer, more expensive, and less reliable than it had been 12 months earlier. Now consider the timing dimension of this problem. Agriculture operates on biological schedules that do not respond to geopolitical negotiations. In the Northern Hemisphere, the critical window for spring planting runs from approximately March through May depending on latitude and crop type. Corn, maize, is typically planted in North America between April and June. Winter wheat, already in the ground, receives its spring nitrogen application between February and April. Spring wheat planting in Canada and the northern U.S. begins in April. European grain farmers follow broadly similar schedules. Indian farmers planting summer crops begin their season in June following the monsoon onset, but their fertilizer procurement happens months earlier. For all of these planting windows, the fertilizer that will be applied has typically been ordered, purchased, and either delivered or contracted for delivery well in advance of the planting date itself. Agricultural distributors and cooperatives work on procurement cycles that lead planting by 6 to 12 weeks. This means that the fertilizer decisions being made right now, in February 2026, determine the yield outcomes that will appear in granaries in October and November 2026. The harvest being planted this spring is not a future event. It is a present decision. And the inputs required for that decision were, as of mid-February 2026, priced at levels that were forcing farmers across the Northern Hemisphere to make substitutions and reductions they would not otherwise choose. The price data from mid-February 2026 was striking. Diammonium phosphate spot prices on the Tampa, Florida benchmark, one of the key global reference prices for phosphate fertilizers, had reached levels not seen since the 2022 commodity spike. MAP, monoammonium phosphate, showed similar movement, where potash prices, while somewhat more stable, had also moved higher as Black Sea supply routes remained disrupted by the ongoing consequences of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. For a corn farmer in Iowa or Illinois, the practical consequence of these price movements was significant. Corn requires approximately 150 to 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre, combined with phosphate and potash applications depending on soil test results. At 2024 fertilizer prices, a typical corn farmer applying inputs to 1,000 acres spent approximately $150 to $200 per acre on fertilizer. At February 2026 prices, that figure had risen to between $220 and $280 per acre by some estimates. For a 1,000-acre operation, the additional cost represented $70,000 to $80,000 per planting season. Not every farmer has the working capital or credit access to absorb that increase. Those who cannot absorb it face a binary choice: reduce fertilizer application and accept lower yields, or reduce planted acreage and accept lower production volume. Either outcome flows downstream into the global food supply. The historical parallel that carries the most analytical weight here is not the 2022 fertilizer shock, though that is instructive. The more precise comparison is the sequence of events that produced the global food price crisis of 2007 and 2008. That crisis was not caused by a single event. It was caused by a convergence of pressures that individually would have been manageable, but collectively overwhelmed the system's buffering capacity. Drought in Australia reduced wheat production. Rising energy prices increased fertilizer costs and agricultural transport costs simultaneously. Expanding biofuel mandates in the United States diverted corn from food use to ethanol production. Accelerating demand from growing middle classes in China and India put upward pressure on global grain prices. And crucially, global grain stocks, the buffer inventories that absorb production shortfalls, were at historically low levels, reducing the system's ability to smooth out the shock. When rice-producing nations including Vietnam, India, and Egypt introduced export restrictions in 2008 to protect domestic supplies, the already elevated world price spiked further. Rice prices roughly tripled in the space of a few months. Food riots occurred in more than 30 countries. The World Food Program reported that its budget was insufficient to meet growing demand for emergency food assistance. The 2007 to 2008 food crisis ended not through policy intervention, but through the 2008 financial crisis, which suppressed global demand broadly and caused commodity prices to collapse. That is not a solution anyone would voluntarily choose. In 2026, several of the conditions that produced the 2007 to 2008 crisis were present simultaneously, with one addition. The geopolitical dimension was considerably more acute. In 2007 and 2008, the fertilizer supply chain was functioning normally. In 2026, it was not. The Red Sea disruption alone would have been a manageable stress under ordinary conditions. Combined with the South China Sea shipping uncertainty, Chinese domestic demand pressures, and the ongoing disruption of Black Sea trade routes, the aggregate effect on fertilizer availability and pricing was pushing toward the threshold at which planting decisions, and therefore harvest outcomes, would be materially affected. Now consider the concept of a leading indicator versus a lagging indicator. In economic analysis, a leading indicator is a measurement that changes before the underlying condition it reflects becomes broadly observable. A lagging indicator changes after the fact. Food inflation The price you pay at a supermarket for bread, cooking oil, or pasta is a lagging indicator of agricultural stress. It responds to supply conditions that were established months or years earlier, filtered through processing, storage, transportation, and retail margins. Fertilizer input prices are a leading indicator. When fertilizer prices spike in February, the crop that absorbs them is planted in April, harvested in October, processed in November, and reaches supermarket shelves sometime in the following months. The price signal that consumers experience is delayed by approximately 6 to 12 months from the original input cost shock. This delay creates a dangerous political and policy gap. By the time food prices rise visibly enough to generate public concern and policy response, the decisions that caused the price rise, the planting decisions made under input cost pressure, are already irreversible. You cannot unplant a crop. You cannot retroactively increase yields by applying fertilizer that was not economically available at planting time. The outcome is already determined. The only question is whether the people who will be most affected by it understand what is coming and when. Phosphorus as a geopolitical resource carries a dimension that distinguishes it from most other commodity markets. Unlike oil, which can be substituted at significant cost and inconvenience by renewable energy sources, phosphorus has no substitute in agriculture. Every molecule of phosphorus that a plant incorporates into its structure must come from somewhere external to that plant. It cannot be manufactured from air, water, or sunlight. It must be extracted from the ground, processed, transported, and applied. This creates what resource economists call a structural vulnerability, a dependency that cannot be engineered away, only managed. The agricultural economist Dana Cordell published a widely cited analysis in 2009 arguing that global phosphorus reserves, at then current extraction rates, would be depleted within approximately 50 to 100 years. Subsequent research revised those timelines, accounting for lower grade reserves that become economically viable at higher prices. But the directional point remained valid. Phosphorus is a finite resource whose geographic concentration creates asymmetric geopolitical leverage for the countries that control its largest deposits. Morocco's position in the global phosphate market is structurally comparable, in some respects, to Saudi Arabia's position in the global oil market. Both countries control a disproportionate share of a resource that the global economy cannot function without. Both countries have used that control, through pricing and export decisions, to influence global markets. And both are geopolitically positioned in regions where external instability can ripple directly into supply chain performance. The Western Sahara dimension of Morocco's phosphate industry deserves specific attention. The Boukraya phosphate mine in Western Sahara is one of the world's largest surface phosphate operations. It is connected to the port of El Ain by a conveyor belt that stretches approximately 100 kilometers, one of the longest conveyor belts in the world. The Polisario Front, which contests Morocco's administration of Western Sahara, has periodically blocked this conveyor belt as a political and economic pressure tactic. In November 2020, Polisario fighters blocked the Guerguerat crossing, a key road link in southern Western Sahara, triggering a Moroccan military operation that effectively ended a nearly 30-year ceasefire. The resumption of active tensions in Western Sahara, even below the threshold of major conflict, introduced a persistent operational risk to the phosphate supply chain running through the territory. International legal frameworks around the exploitation of Western Sahara's natural resources are contested. The European Court of Justice ruled in 2016, and again in subsequent decisions, that EU trade agreements with Morocco did not automatically cover Western Sahara, raising compliance questions for European importers of Moroccan phosphate. These legal and political complexities layer on top of the logistics disruptions to create a supply picture that is considerably more fragile than simple market statistics suggest. Russia's role in the fertilizer story requires a separate analysis thread. Before February 2022, Russia and Belarus together accounted for approximately 40% of global potash exports. Russia was also a major exporter of nitrogen fertilizers, particularly urea and ammonia, whose production depends heavily on natural gas as a feedstock. When the United States, European Union, and other Western governments imposed comprehensive sanctions on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, fertilizer was initially carved out as a humanitarian exception. U.S. Treasury guidance specifically stated that agricultural commodities and fertilizers were not subject to sanctions restrictions, in recognition of the global food security implications of restricting Russian fertilizer exports. The European Union took a similar position. But sanctions on Russian banks, shipping companies, and insurance providers created what trade finance experts called de-risking pressure, a reluctance by Western financial institutions to process transactions involving Russian exporters even when those transactions were technically legal. The practical effect was to reduce the flow of Russian fertilizer to global markets even in the absence of a formal prohibition. Belarus, whose potash exports were more directly targeted by sanctions, experienced a more complete disruption of its export capacity. Belarusian Potash Company, one of the world's major potash exporters, lost access to Lithuanian port facilities in 2021 before the Ukraine invasion, following Western pressure on Vilnius to deny transit rights. The combination of these pressures removed a significant volume of potash and nitrogen fertilizer from the global market between 2022 and 2026. Prices adjusted upward. They never fully returned to pre-2022 levels, and they were rising again in early 2026. There's a concept in food security analysis called calorie nationalism. It describes the tendency of food-producing nations, when global food prices rise sharply and domestic supply appears threatened, to restrict exports in order to protect their own populations. The logic is straightforward. A government facing electoral pressure from its own citizens, experiencing food price spikes, has a strong incentive to ensure domestic supply by keeping domestically produced food at home. Export restrictions reduce global supply, which pushes global prices higher, which creates additional pressure on other governments to impose their own restrictions. The dynamic is self-reinforcing. Each country's protective action worsens the conditions that prompted every other country's protective action. The 2007 to 2008 food crisis documented this pattern clearly. Rice export restrictions by Vietnam, India, and Egypt in 2008 were each individually rational responses to domestic political pressure. Collectively, they amplified the global price spike that was driving that pressure in the first place. In 2026, the conditions that historically precede calorie nationalism were assembling. Input cost shocks reducing planted acreage, logistics disruptions, creating uncertainty about import availability, geopolitical tensions, making long-term supply agreements harder to negotiate and enforce, and global grain stocks, which had been gradually rebuilding after the 2022 stress, facing fresh drawdown pressure from a combination of weather events and policy uncertainties. The question being asked in agricultural trade circles in February 2026 was not whether some major food producers would impose export restrictions before the year's end. The question was, which ones, when, and in what sequence? India's position in this story is particularly worth examining. India is simultaneously one of the world's largest agricultural producers, one of the world's largest fertilizer importers, and a country with a history of using food export restrictions as a domestic policy tool. In 2023, India banned exports of non-basmati white rice, citing domestic price concerns following a poor monsoon season. The ban affected global rice markets significantly, given India's position as the world's largest rice exporter by volume, responsible for approximately 40% of global rice trade. Thailand and Vietnam, the next largest exporters, could not compensate for the volume India withdrew from the market. Rice prices rose sharply. Countries that depend on rice imports across Southeast Asia, West Africa, and parts of the Middle East faced elevated food import bills at a moment when many of their currencies were already under pressure from dollar strength. The 2023 Indian rice export ban was a preview of the calorie nationalism dynamic at scale. In 2026, with fertilizer input costs rising and planting decisions being made under economic pressure, the conditions for a repeat, or an escalation, of that dynamic were clearly present. The nitrogen dimension of the fertilizer story adds a second analytical layer. Nitrogen fertilizers, primarily urea and ammonia-based products, are synthesized through the Haber-Bosch process, discovered by German chemists Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch in the early 20th century. The Haber-Bosch process combines atmospheric nitrogen with hydrogen under high pressure and temperature to produce ammonia, which is then processed into various fertilizer compounds. The critical input for this process is not nitrogen, which is freely available in the atmosphere, but hydrogen, which is typically derived from natural gas through a process called steam methane reforming. This means that nitrogen fertilizer production is directly and tightly linked to natural gas prices. When natural gas prices are high, nitrogen fertilizer production becomes more expensive. When natural gas prices spike dramatically, as they did in Europe in 2021 and 2022 following Russia's manipulation of pipeline flows and then the invasion of Ukraine, nitrogen fertilizer production in Europe becomes uneconomic. Several major European fertilizer plants shut down temporarily in 2021 and 2022 because the cost of producing fertilizer exceeded the price they could receive for selling it. The CF Industries plant in Billingham, England, one of the largest ammonia producers in the United Kingdom, halted production in September 2021 when natural gas prices reached levels that made continued operation commercially unviable. This particular shutdown had a secondary consequence that illustrated the systemic nature of the fertilizer supply chain. The Billingham plant was also the primary domestic producer of food-grade carbon dioxide in the United Kingdom. Carbon dioxide is used in food packaging to extend shelf life, in carbonated beverages, and in abattoir operations for animal stunning. When the fertilizer plant shut down, the UK faced a carbon dioxide shortage that threatened meat processing, food packaging, and the pub industry simultaneously. A single industrial facility, shutting down because fertilizer margins had inverted due to gas prices set in Moscow, cascaded into food supply concerns across an entire national economy. This is what supply chain interdependence looks like in practice. Not a direct connection, but a chain of dependencies where disruption at one node propagates unpredictably through the entire network. By February 2026, European natural gas prices had stabilized considerably from their 2022 peaks, following a combination of demand reduction, infrastructure diversification, including new LNG import terminals, and milder winter weather. European nitrogen fertilizer production had largely resumed. But the memory of the 2021 to 2022 disruption had left a lasting mark on fertilizer procurement behavior across European agriculture. Farmers and agricultural cooperatives had shifted toward earlier procurement and larger inventory positions, precisely to avoid being caught without supply during a price spike. This behavior change itself contributed to price volatility, front-loaded demand creating price spikes during procurement seasons, followed by softer prices as inventory was drawn down. The February 2026 price environment reflected both the genuine supply pressure from phosphate logistics disruptions and this demand-side procurement anxiety. Separating the two was difficult, but the market signal, elevated prices across multiple fertilizer categories simultaneously, suggested that the underlying physical supply constraint was real, not merely a sentiment-driven speculative move. The geopolitical leverage embedded in fertilizer supply chains has begun attracting the attention of strategic planners in ways that would have seemed unusual a decade ago. Food security has historically been treated as an agricultural policy matter, managed by ministries of agriculture, evaluated through crop surveys and trade statistics, and addressed through instruments like food aid, subsidies, and trade agreements. In 2026, it was increasingly being evaluated through a national security lens. The United States had designated fertilizer supply chain resilience as a critical infrastructure priority following the 2022 shock. The European Union's strategic autonomy agenda included explicit attention to reducing dependency on imported fertilizers. Several countries, including India, had been investing in domestic phosphate processing capacity to reduce reliance on imported finished fertilizer products. China had been systematically building strategic reserves of agricultural inputs, but these longer-term structural adjustments take years to materialize. They could not address the supply-demand imbalance of February 2026. The infrastructure being built today produces the fertilizer that arrives in 2028 or 2029. It does nothing for the farmer deciding in February 2026 how much phosphate to apply to fields that will be planted in April. The human dimension of this story is worth pausing on. The aggregate statistics, phosphate prices, shipping costs, fertilizer application rates, translate into individual decisions made by individual farmers working within tight economic margins. Agriculture in the United States, Europe, and across the major grain-producing regions of the world is, by and large, a business conducted by operators who are simultaneously entrepreneurs, environmental managers, and risk absorbers. The capital requirements of modern farming are substantial. Land, equipment, seed, fertilizer, and operating expenses represent significant fixed and variable costs that must be financed, typically through agricultural credit. When fertilizer prices increase by 30 to 50% within a single procurement cycle, the working capital pressure on farm operations increases proportionally. Smaller and less financially capitalized operations have limited options. They can borrow more if credit is available and the interest cost is manageable. They can reduce input intensity, accepting lower yields but also lower costs. They can reduce planted area, producing less but preserving margins. Or they can exit and sell land or equipment, retire early, or transition to less input-intensive land uses. Agricultural consolidation, the trend toward fewer, larger farming operations, has been driven partly by input cost economics over the past several decades. High input price environments accelerate that consolidation by disproportionately pressuring smaller operators. The farms that exit the market in 2026 under fertilizer cost pressure do not return when prices normalize. The structural production capacity that is lost for years. On the October 2026 harvest will tell a partial story, but the full story will not be visible until the spring of 2027, when winter crops planted under the input conditions of late 2026 come to maturity. Agricultural systems, like geological systems, operate on timescales that are poorly matched to the news cycle. The decision chain that connects a phosphate mine in Morocco to a loaf of bread in a European supermarket runs through approximately 12 to 18 months of processing, shipping, application, germination, growth, harvest, milling, and distribution. Each step in that chain is managed by different actors operating under different constraints. The disruption in any one link is not immediately visible at the consumer end. It accumulates silently through the chain until it emerges as a price signal or a supply shortage at retail. By that point, the options available to policymakers and consumers are considerably more constrained than they were at the beginning of the chain. This is the structural reality of agricultural systems. They are robust over long time periods and across small disturbances, but they are slow to respond to sudden disruptions. And in 2026, the disturbances were neither small nor slow. There is a final analytical thread worth drawing out. The countries most exposed to the consequences of a 2026 fertilizer supply disruption are not the wealthy agricultural exporters. They are the net food importers, countries whose domestic agricultural production cannot meet domestic consumption needs and who rely on global markets to bridge the gap. Many of these countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South and Southeast Asia. Several are also carrying heavy debt burdens in currencies that have depreciated against the dollar, the currency in which most agricultural commodities are priced. For these countries, a simultaneous increase in the dollar price of imported food and a weakening of domestic currency represents a double compression on food import capacity. The 2022 food price shock contributed directly to political instability in Sri Lanka, whose foreign exchange crisis was partly driven by the inability to finance fertilizer and fuel imports. Sri Lanka's government fell in July 2022 as protesters stormed the presidential palace. The fertilizer supply chain that connects a Moroccan mine and a Chinese export terminal to the political stability of a government in Colombo or Khartoum or Cairo is long, indirect, and invisible in ordinary conditions. It becomes visible only when it breaks. And in February 2026, it was showing the early signals of breaking. What the data from mid-February 2026 was saying, read carefully and in sequence, was the following. Phosphate spot prices were at elevated levels consistent with a significant supply disruption. Shipping costs for bulk fertilizer transport were elevated due to Red Sea and South China Sea routing pressures. Chinese export availability was constrained by domestic demand prioritization. Black Sea potash supply remained below pre-2022 levels. Northern Hemisphere planting windows were weeks away, and global grain stocks, while not at crisis levels, had limited capacity to buffer a production shortfall of meaningful size. Each of these data points, taken individually, would be a manageable concern. Taken together, they described a system under simultaneous pressure across multiple inputs, routes, and geographies. The agricultural input shock was not a prediction. It was a present observation. The harvest disruption that follows from it is not a scenario. It is a delayed consequence of decisions already made and conditions already in place. The gap between now and its visibility at the consumer level is the only variable still in play. And that gap in agricultural systems is measured in seasons, not days. The spring planting decisions being made this week will determine what arrives on dinner tables this autumn. The fertilizer that is not applied in April cannot be retroactively added in August. The yield that is not achieved in October cannot be borrowed from November. This is the discipline of biology, asserting itself against the wishful thinking of economics and politics. The soil does not negotiate. It responds to what it receives. And in the spring of 2026, across a significant share of the Northern Hemisphere's agricultural land, what it was going to receive was less than what the harvest calculations assumed.